Show you this Guardian headline. World's 5 richest men double their money as poorest get poorer. Oxfam predicts first trillionaire within a decade, with gap between rich and poor likely to increase. Liam, your new book then is pretty timely, The Inequality of Wealth. Does it matter that the rich are getting richer?
What really matters is that our market has stopped working for everybody. So in Britain, over the last 13 years, the top 1% have multiplied their wealth by 31 times as much as everybody else. And when you look around the world at very unequal societies, they've got a couple of things in common. They tend to become very corrupt, quite poor and quite stagnant. And I now really worry about those things unfolding here in Britain. And so what the book tries to do is to basically say, look, it doesn't have to be like this. Most of the book is actually devoted to 4 or 5 quite big answers that we could implement here. They've been tried and tested in other parts of the world, and where I think we need to have a debate here if we're to actually rebuild that old ideal, which is a wealth-owning democracy.
That's happened on Conservative government's watch.
Well, I haven't read Liam's book. I look forward to having time to do so when I've left politics. I think for me,
it's a great read.
I'm sure it is. I'll pay you $10.99 later, however much is needed. For me, one of the really key points, actually, that has been there in the Conservative story since 2010 is the growth in jobs. I get particularly motivated by this. I see this, and I see the power of this in my constituency and elsewhere. Nearly 4 million people more in work since 2010, since Liam's time in government. That is actually the way in which people find their own opportunities, find their own power in life. That's, for me, the most interesting item in a broader debate.
Liam's talking about wealth inequality.
Yes, he is, and actually before we came into the studio, we were talking about the difference between wealth and income, and I understand that technically. What's also true, actually, when you look at the tax take that is there from the top 1%, that has also gone up under the Conservative record, and indeed since Liam's time as in the Treasury.
But we're talking there about income tax, and we always do. We always focus on income. Are people in work? Are they getting paid? What are they getting taxed? We never talk about tax rates on wealth. That's the big missing part of our national debate, and we don't talk about tax rates on property. The fact that, council tax is so unevenly applied across the country, capital gains doesn't apply to primary residences. It's very easy to have wealth in this country and pay very little in tax, while a recent graduate will pay 51% of their income in tax after £50,000.
The case in point is the Prime Minister. I mean, the Prime Minister, to his credit, published his tax return recently. Shows about an income of around about 2 million, but it also showed a tax rate of about 21%. At a time when 1 in 5 people are paying 40%. And I think most people in this country feel it's time that we return the tax code to our moral code. And if we did that, actually, there would be the resources to help create funds that could give, for example, young people a dividend once a year to help them put down a deposit on their home. So we've got some real problems now that people can't afford a home, a pension, a retirement for their golden years. And we've got to have a big conversation now about actually how do we rebuild that old ideal, shared on both left and right, by the way, of a wealth-owning democracy.
Right.
Well, I think that really what you're talking about, some of those structural challenges, for instance, around housing, it feels to me as though Harry's illustrated there are quite a lot of taxes which tax various forms of wealth. And the question is, what are those barriers to opportunity that mean that people can't get on the housing ladder, for instance? It feels to me as though we're starting at the wrong place, right? We should be starting around housing supply, housing availability, the way that our entire network of housing works, for instance, right, to talk about opportunity for young people. We should be talking about education. It feels to me as though the question of why don't we just have an additional tax doesn't really fix, for instance, how you make the existing tax system work better, and also how you tackle the ways in which equality has enhanced and increased and spread through structural things, not just through taxation.
Harry?
But isn't the big problem that the tax system creates or prevents inequalities? And it's not even that we're advocating higher taxes overall, it's just about changing the distribution.
Exactly.
Why is it being so heavily applied on income and comparatively less applied on forms of wealth?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of with the IFS on this, which is that a wealth tax really has to be unexpected and probably one-off to generate any significant amounts of revenue. And then how does that structurally... Because the challenge around taxation, as you know already, is about how you accumulate the correct tax take relative to the ways in which you might be able to move your money around. And that structurally isn't addressed by just saying, why don't we have an additional tax? Basically, the point is, this is very difficult and very complicated. And the idea there's a one one thing you can pick off the shelf
there's 4 or
that
5
will
different things you
change,
can
or
do.
4 or 5 things you can pick off that shelf that will fundamentally change the way that wealth accumulates in this country, I think is too simplistic.
But it is wrong that Rishi Sunak pays half the rate of tax.
This is just like,
of
why don't
1 in 5.
I don't like
What
a
are you
man's got money, okay. But like,
No,
what are the
he's paying
structural challenges?
21% tax when 1 in 5 people are paying 40% tax. And actually, if we returned fairness to the tax system, that would allow us to build what 80 countries around the world have done, which is a sovereign wealth fund, and actually a dividend from that sovereign wealth fund could provide every 25-year-old, this is not my idea, by the way, this is David Willits' idea, it could provide every young person with a £10,000 tax break to help them put down a deposit on a home. £10,000 is the average shortfall on a deposit for a home. You can't build your way out of the housing problem with only 4%.
So why isn't Labour doing it? I mean, why isn't Labour doing it? I mean, if you look at tax, they're not looking at wealth taxes, are they? They're not looking at equalising capital gains tax, rightly or wrongly. They're not looking at taxing this would-be income, of course, the top 5%, which was part of his...
Well,
is this what you're hoping that Keir Starmer's going to take on?
No, surprise, surprise. It's an election year, and it's very difficult to take big decisions on tax in an election year. It's also quite a bad idea if you're in opposition to take big decisions on tax. And so what the purpose of the book, if you like, is to say, look, there is a big problem in Britain. It's going to get a lot worse as the baby boomers die and bequeath $5.5 trillion in assets. If we want to build a wealth-owning democracy in our country, then we're going to need to do some big things, and we're going to start thinking about them now.
Are you disappointed that some of this isn't being taken on, hasn't been taken on?
Yeah, and I think it's very strange not to prepare the ground in any way, because there's nothing that the press is going to love more than attacking Rachel Reeves when she does introduce anything that looks like a wealth tax, whereas she could be preparing the ground for some of these changes. And just make a simple argument that individual policies are overwhelmingly popular when it comes to forms of wealth tax. There's no reason, we're talking about housing a lot, there's no reason why a landlord doesn't pay national insurance on the rent they get paid, but an employee does pay national insurance. You know, we have an antiquated system that just allows those with wealth to get away with lower tax rates.
Right. I mean, isn't it true that, you know, as the Conservatives have sort of run government since 2010, the rich literally have got richer and are keeping more of their money?
Well, no. So the statistic I began by talking to you about. Well, let me deliver one statistic, Liam, and then you can have a go at it.
I'm not talking about income, but wealth.
Well, Joe, on your point of have they paid more money, the answer to that is yes, they have. The top 1% in the last 10 years has paid almost double in absolute terms than what they began by paying. And so that figure is currently at about 71 billion in the tax take. She asked, have they paid more? I'm providing the answer.
Well, on wealth.
Providing an answer. That 71 billion is pretty handy in terms of paying for public services. Now, there are so many broader points here that have already been raised in the debate. I happen to think that the housing point Anita raised is absolutely critical in this, in terms of being able to accumulate wealth during a lifetime.
100%.
Or
You
indeed,
can't build your way out of the problem.
But the restraints on supply are really significant in this debate.
They're
really
important,
significant.
but only 4% of people, young people without a home, have got both the deposit and the earnings to be able to buy a home. So unless you actually help people put down a down payment on their home, frankly, it's going to be a pipe dream.
Right.
But greater housing supply could mean that rents are lower, so people could build their own deposits. The idea that what you should do is give people more money, and that what you should... I mean, Labour were very critical of Help to Buy and all those schemes, saying, well, all you're doing is basically inflating the whole housing system by giving people more money.
Well, to be fair, these are the ideas of Liam Byrne rather than
lacking
Labour,
a bit of... and it's interesting that you talk about the need for addressing apathy and going out there with radical ideas, and yet we're not seeing Labour really engaging in any radical ideas for how you might improve the structure of the state.
Well,
I mean, you're trying your best. I'm not sure I'm convinced, but maybe others would be.
Have a look at the book. But the point is that wealth inequality in our country has got a heck of a lot worse over the last 13 years, not least because we put £850 billion of quantitative easing into the system.
Wow.
If you owned assets, that had a massive impact on your wealth. Income from investment has doubled to about 80 billion over the course of this century. But as Harry said, and Harry's written brilliantly about this, the way that we tax that money at the moment means that you pay half the rate of tax that everybody else does. And I think most people in our country, they do want a tax code that reflects our moral code.
Yeah, and just the proportion of wealth in this country, private wealth, has doubled in the last 25 years. And we haven't seen anything like an equivalent increase in the tax take from wealth. So it's all very well to say the 1% have paid a lot of money on their income, but the reality is there are vast stores of wealth. And we keep acting like the government's essentially bankrupt, there's no money left. But that's not the case anymore. There are pockets where you could raise a lot of money.
I just want to show the front